The suitcase hitting the floor made Jimmy flinch, his small hands flying to his ears as he rocked back and forth on our threadbare couch. But Ethan didn't notice. He never noticed anymore. He was too busy adjusting that expensive tie, the one I'd bought him for his promotion, back when I thought we were building something together. Clara, you know I can't do this anymore. Those words, God, those words still echo in my head like a death sentence. I was standing in our kitchen, holding Jimmy's sensory bottle, the one I'd made from an old water bottle, glitter and corn syrup, because we couldn't afford the fancy ones the therapist recommended. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. Emily understands me, he continued, not even looking at our son, who was now humming that same tune he'd been perfecting for weeks. She wants a normal life, normal kids. Normal. There it was, the word that had been poisoning our marriage for 2 years, ever since Jimmy's diagnosis. The word that made my beautiful, brilliant boy sound like a mistake. I smiled then, not because I was happy, God, no. I smiled because something clicked into place, like a lock turning. Of course, Ethan, you deserve your perfect life. He actually looked relieved. Can you believe that? Relieved. As if I'd just given him permission to abandon his family like we were some charity case he'd grown tired of supporting. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. Because this story, this beautiful, twisted story of karma, starts way before that Tuesday afternoon when my husband walked out on us. Jimmy was 5 when we got the diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder, high functioning, they said, as if that label would somehow make it easier for Ethan to swallow. I remember sitting in that sterile doctor's office, watching my husband's face crumble. As the paediatrician explained stimming, sensory processing, and all the ways our son experienced the world differently. What does this mean for his future? Ethan had asked, and I could hear the panic in his voice. With proper support and therapy, children with autism can lead fulfilling lives, the doctor assured us. Jimmy is bright, verbal, and shows excellent potential for independence. But Ethan didn't hear excellent potential. He heard different. He heard difficult. He heard his dreams of coaching Little League and teaching his son to drive crashing down around him. I threw myself into research that night. I read every article, joined every support group, and learned about sensory diets, communication strategies, and how to turn our home into a safe space for Jimmy. I found the beauty in my son's uniqueness, the way he could remember every detail of his favourite movies, how he noticed patterns others missed, the pure joy on his face when he mastered something new. Ethan started working later, coming home after Jimmy's bedtime, making excuses to avoid parent-teacher conferences and therapy appointments. I just don't understand him, he'd say when Jimmy would have a meltdown over a change in routine. Why can't he just be normal? The final straw came at Jimmy's 6th birthday party. I'd planned everything carefully. Small guest list, quiet music, Jimmy's favourite foods. But when the neighbourhood kids started playing a loud game of tag, Jimmy got overwhelmed and hid under the table, covering his ears and crying. Instead of comforting our son, Ethan snapped, "Get up, Jimmy! You're embarrassing yourself!" I'll never forget the look on my baby's face. Pure confusion and hurt. That's when I knew, really knew, that Ethan saw Jimmy as a problem to be fixed rather than a child to be loved. The affair started 3 months later. Emily from his office, young, blonde, everything I used to be before sleepless nights and stress aged me beyond my years. She had no children, no complications, no messy realities to deal with. She was, in Ethan's words, uncomplicated. I found out the way wives always do. The late meetings that weren't on his calendar, the cologne I didn't recognise, the way he suddenly needed a new wardrobe to project success at work. I could have confronted him, could have demanded answers, could have fought for our marriage. Instead, I started planning. See, here's what Ethan never understood about Jimmy's autism. It wasn't just random. There were genetic components, hereditary factors that ran in families. I'd done the research, talked to the specialists, understood the science in ways my husband never bothered to learn. Autism doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's woven into family DNA like a secret waiting to be discovered. While Ethan was busy building his perfect new life with Emily, I was quietly documenting everything. Every therapy session he missed, every milestone he ignored, every time he chose his uncomplicated girlfriend over his complicated son. I kept records, screenshots, emails, a paper trail of abandonment that would serve me well later. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday. Ethan wanted joint custody, of course, not because he wanted to parent Jimmy, but because it looked better in court. His lawyer had probably told him it would reduce his child support obligations. But I had something Ethan didn't. The truth. 2 years of documented evidence showing a father who couldn't handle his son's diagnosis, who consistently chose work and his mistress over his child's needs, who had essentially abandoned his parental responsibilities long before he physically left. The custody hearing was swift. Ethan got every other weekend and 1 evening per week, which might as well have been nothing. Jimmy barely knew his father anymore anyway. And Emily? Sweet, naive Emily was already posting ultrasound photos on Instagram to start planning her perfect nursery with themes of dreams come true and miracles happen. She had no idea that her miracle was about to become her nightmare. I spent the next 6 months preparing, not just for single motherhood. I'd basically been doing that for years, but for what I knew was coming, because genetics don't lie, and family history doesn't disappear just because you pretend it doesn't exist. Jimmy and I developed our routine: speech therapy on Tuesdays, occupational therapy on Thursdays, and quiet weekends where we worked on his social skills and sensory regulation. He was thriving without his father's constant disappointment weighing him down. Meanwhile, Ethan's social media showed nothing but bliss. Romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and increasingly frequent posts about their miracle baby on the way. Emily glowed in every photo, her hand always resting on her growing belly, both of them radiating that nauseating confidence that comes from believing you've escaped life's complications. The baby shower photos were particularly hard to stomach. A lavish affair with pink decorations everywhere, games about perfect babies and dream families. I recognised some of the guests, our former mutual friends who'd chosen sides after the divorce and decided Ethan's new beginning was more appealing than Jimmy's reality. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that nature has a way of demanding acknowledgement, of refusing to be ignored no matter how perfect you think your new life is going to be. The night before Sophia was born, I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. I stood in Jimmy's doorway watching my beautiful boy sleep peacefully, his favourite weighted blanket pulled up to his chin. In 12 hours, his half-sister would be born, and in a few months after that, the real drama would begin. I'd been waiting for this moment for almost a year. Every therapy session I attended alone, every milestone Ethan missed, every night I comforted Jimmy when he cried for a daddy who was too busy with his normal life to call. It was all leading to this. Because here's the thing about revenge. The best kind isn't about getting even. It's about being exactly where you need to be when karma finally comes calling. And karma, I knew, was about to knock on Ethan and Emily's door with tiny fists and a familiar cry. The call would come soon. And when it did, I'd be ready. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the Instagram post Emily had shared just hours earlier. Little Sophia, 2 weeks old, sleeping peacefully in her designer nursery with the caption, "Our perfect angel." Perfect. There was that word again. I let it ring twice before answering, savouring the moment I'd been anticipating for months. When I heard Ethan's voice, broken and desperate, I almost laughed out loud. Clara, I need... God, I don't know what to do." He was crying. Actually crying. This was the same man who told me to toughen up when Jimmy had his first major meltdown at the grocery store. The same man who'd said emotional breakdowns were just attention-seeking behaviour. "Ethan, it's almost 3 a.m. What's wrong?" "It's Sophia," he whispered, and I could hear Emily sobbing in the background. "The paediatrician wants to run some tests. She's not meeting her milestones. She won't make eye contact, and she cries when Emily tries to hold her. The doctor mentioned they think she might." He couldn't say it, Even now, even when it was his precious new daughter, he couldn't say the word autism. I sat up in bed, pulling my robe around me like armor. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. What do you need, Ethan? I know I have no right to ask this, but could you come over? You know about this stuff. You understand it better than anyone. Rich, considering he'd never bothered to learn anything about Jimmy's condition himself. I'll be there in an hour, I said, and hung up before he could thank me. I checked on Jimmy first. He was sleeping soundly, his noise-cancelling headphones still on from his bedtime routine. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Mummy's going to go help your sister, baby. Everything's going to be different now." The drive to Ethan's new house, the one he'd bought with Emily in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and a 2-car garage, gave me time to compose myself. I'd practiced this moment in my head dozens of times, but now that it was here, I felt almost giddy with anticipation. Emily answered the door, and, God, she looked awful. Her perfect blonde hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy bun. Her designer pajamas were stained with spit up, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. This was not the glowing new mother from her social media posts. "Clara, thank you so much for coming," she said, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. "I know this is awkward, but Ethan said you'd know what to do." I followed her into their living room. All white furniture and glass coffee tables, the kind of space that screamed, "No children allowed." It was the opposite of our old home, where every surface was Jimmy-proofed, and every corner held sensory toys and comfort items. Ethan was pacing by the window, holding Sophia, who was indeed crying. That particular high-pitched wail I recognised from Jimmy's early days. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine fear. "She won't stop crying," he said helplessly, "and when she does sleep, she won't let us touch her. Emily can barely nurse her because she arches her back and screams. The paediatrician says it could be colic, but you know it's not," I finished calmly, extending my arms. "May I?" He handed Sophia to me, and the moment I held her, she began to settle. Not because I was magic, but because I knew what to do. I'd learned these techniques with Jimmy, the gentle pressure, the specific way to position her body, the soft humming that provided auditory comfort without overstimulation. Within minutes she was quiet, her tiny fists unclenched, her breathing steady. Emily stared at me like I performed a miracle. "How did you—" "Experience," I said simply, settling into their pristine white chair with Sophia cradled against me. Jimmy was the same way as a baby. Hypersensitive to touch, easily overstimulated, difficulty with feeding and sleeping. Ethan's face went pale. But Jimmy wasn't diagnosed until he was 5. No, Jimmy wasn't diagnosed until he was 5, I corrected. But the signs were there from birth. I just didn't know what to look for then. I do now. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Emily processing this information, her carefully constructed fantasy beginning to crack. "What are you saying?" she whispered. I looked down at beautiful little Sophia, so peaceful in my arms, and felt a surge of genuine love for this innocent child who was about to change everything. "I'm saying that autism often has genetic components. It runs in families." Emily's eyes widened as she turned to stare at Ethan. "You never told me that. You said Jimmy's condition was just random." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say. He'd never bothered to learn about the hereditary aspects of autism, because acknowledging them would mean admitting that Jimmy's condition wasn't some cosmic accident or punishment. It was part of who he was, written into his very DNA. "The early signs are there," I continued softly, stroking Sophia's tiny hand. "The sensory sensitivity, the difficulty with regulation, the feeding issues. She'll need early intervention, just like Jimmy did. The sooner you start, the better her outcomes will be." Emily sank onto their expensive couch, her perfect world crumbling around her. "But she's only 2 weeks old. How can you tell?" "Because I've been living this reality for 7 years, I said, and for the first time since arriving, I let some steel enter my voice. While Jimmy's father was too busy pretending autism was something that happened to other families, Ethan flinched like I'd slapped him. "Good. What do we do?" Emily asked, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You love her, I said simply. You learn everything you can about her needs. You find the right therapists, the right support systems. You become her advocate instead of her obstacle. I stood up, still holding Sophia, and walked to the window. Their neighbourhood was perfect. Manicured lawns matching mailboxes, the kind of place where different was discouraged and conformity was king. You know, I said conversationally, Jimmy asked me just last week why his daddy never comes to his therapy appointments. I told him that some people aren't ready to handle how special he is. Ethan's breath caught. Clara. But now, I continued, turning to face them both, now you're going to learn what I learned. That loving a child with autism isn't about fixing them or making them normal. It's about understanding that they already are perfect, exactly as they are. Emily was crying again, but these weren't the desperate sobs from earlier. These were the tears of recognition, of understanding that her life had just taken a dramatic turn she never saw coming. I gently placed Sophia in her bassinet, using the techniques I'd mastered with Jimmy. The soft transition, the continued contact until she was settled, the quiet humming that provided comfort. I should go, I said, gathering my purse. It's been a long night for all of us. Wait, Ethan called out as I reached the door. What happens now? I smiled, the same smile I'd given him the day he packed his suitcase. Now, you get to experience the life you walked away from. The therapy appointments, the sleepless nights, the meltdowns, the judgment from other parents, all of it. But we don't know how to. Then you'll learn, I said simply, the same way I did. Alone. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Satisfaction. Not because I was cruel, but because justice was finally being served. Ethan would now understand what he'd put Jimmy and me through. Emily would learn that perfect families are a myth, and that real love means accepting your child exactly as they are. But this was just the beginning, because I had plans for little Sophia, plans that would ensure she got the love and support Jimmy had been denied by his father, plans that would make Ethan face every mistake he'd made, every appointment he'd missed, every moment he'd chosen his comfort over his son's needs. The real revenge was just getting started. The calls started coming daily after that first night. Emily, desperate and drowning, reaching out to the one person who seemed to understand what they were going through. Each ring of my phone was like music to my ears, a symphony of karma playing exactly the tune I'd been waiting to hear. Clara, I'm so sorry to bother you again. Emily's voice was shaky, exhausted. It was day 3 since my midnight visit, but Sophia hasn't slept more than 20 minutes at a time, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I was folding Jimmy's laundry, his soft, tagless shirts that I'd learned to buy after years of trial and error. It's not about doing something wrong, Emily. It's about doing something different. Have you tried the weighted sleep sack I mentioned? Ethan said those were too expensive for something that might not work. Ethan said, how interesting. The same man who'd bought a $60,000 car to impress his new wife was suddenly concerned about the cost of his daughter's comfort. I have Jimmy's old one, I offered, knowing exactly how this would sound. He outgrew it years ago. I could bring it by. The silence on the other end was telling. Emily was realizing that everything Sophia needed, I already had. Every solution, every piece of equipment, every strategy. I'd been living this reality while her husband pretended it didn't exist. That would be amazing, she whispered. Clara, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Emily. We're family now. Family. I let that word hang in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. When I arrived at their house that afternoon, I came prepared. Not just with the sleep sack, but with a carefully curated collection of items. Sensory toys, specialised bottles, noise-cancelling headphones sized for infants. Everything was pristine, barely used, because I'd been stockpiling supplies for years, preparing for this exact moment. You had all of this? Emily stared at the bags I'd brought, her eyes wide with disbelief. I have a whole storage room full of things Jimmy outgrew, I said, arranging the items on their coffee table like a display of evidence. Swings, weighted blankets, communication devices, therapy tools, 7 years' worth of collecting. Ethan emerged from his home office, looking haggard. Dark circles under his eyes, his usually perfect hair dishevelled. "Clara, this is too much. We can't accept all this." "Why not?" I asked innocently. "Jimmy doesn't need them anymore, and Sophia does. Unless you'd prefer to figure it out on your own." The trap was set. Accept my help and acknowledge that I'd been right all along, or refuse and struggle alone with a screaming baby. Either way, I won. Emily grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need this, honey. Look at her. She's already calmer just being around Clara." It was true. Sophia had settled the moment I'd entered their house, responding to the calm confidence I'd developed through years of practice. I knew how to move around a sensory-sensitive child, how to modulate my voice, how to create an environment of safety and understanding, skills her father had never bothered to learn. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone. "I've compiled a list of the best specialists in the area, early intervention programs, occupational therapists, developmental pediatricians. Some have waiting lists, but I know people." Emily's hands were shaking as she took the list. "How do you know all these people?" "Jimmy's been in therapy for 5 years," I said simply. "I've built relationships, learned who's good and who's not. Dr. Patterson is amazing for initial assessments, but she's booked 3 months out, unless, of course, I make a personal recommendation." I watched Ethan's face as the reality hit him. Every connection I'd made, every professional relationship I'd built while he was busy with his normal life, it was all resources he now desperately needed. "I could make some calls," I offered graciously. "Speed up the process for Sophia." "You would do that?" Emily's voice cracked with gratitude. "Of course. She's Jimmy's sister." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Sister. The child he'd tried to replace Jimmy with was now going to need the same support, the same understanding, the same specialised care that he'd rejected in his son. Over the next 2 weeks, I became indispensable. Every day brought new crises: feeding difficulties, sleep disruptions, overstimulation meltdowns. And every day, Emily called me for help. I was patient, knowledgeable, and most importantly, present in ways Ethan had never been for Jimmy. "I don't understand," Emily said one afternoon as we sat in their living room, Sophia finally napping peacefully in my arms using techniques I'd perfected years ago. "How did you manage all this alone?" "I didn't have a choice," I replied, letting just a hint of steel enter my voice. When Jimmy was diagnosed, his father decided it was too difficult. Some people run from challenges, others rise to meet them. Emily's face flushed red. She was starting to see her husband differently, and I was here for every moment of her awakening. The breakthrough came during Sophia's first therapy evaluation. I'd arranged it, of course, called in a favour with Dr. Chen, who'd worked with Jimmy for 3 years. Emily had begged me to come with them, and Ethan, overwhelmed and out of his depth, hadn't protested. Watching him in that appointment was poetry. Dr. Chen asked detailed questions about Sophia's development, her sensory responses, her family history. When she mentioned the genetic components of autism, Ethan's confusion was palpable. "I don't understand," he said. "How can autism be genetic? Jimmy's was it just happened." Dr. Chen looked at him with barely concealed surprise. "Mr. Thompson, autism spectrum disorders have significant hereditary factors. Have you been involved in your son's care and education?" The silence in that room was deafening. Emily stared at her husband like she was seeing him for the first time. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, watching years of lies and avoidance catch up with him. Jimmy lives with his mother," Ethan stammered. "But surely you've attended therapy sessions, parent training workshops, IEP meetings?" Another silence. Emily's face was transforming from confusion to horror as she realised the truth. Her husband had abandoned one child with autism and was now completely unprepared to parent another. "Perhaps Mrs. Thompson could join us for family counselling sessions," Dr. Chen suggested, looking at me. Given her extensive experience and knowledge base, "I'd be happy to help," I said graciously. After all, both children benefit from consistency in their care approach. Walking out of that appointment, Emily was quiet. too quiet. In the parking lot, she finally exploded. "You never told me," she whispered to Ethan, her voice shaking with rage. "You never told me about the therapy, the specialists, the genetic factors. You let me believe Jimmy's autism was just some random thing that happened to your ex-wife. Emily, it's complicated." "No, it's not," she screamed, and little Sophia started crying in response to her mother's distress. "It's simple. You walked away from your son because he wasn't perfect, and now you have another child who needs the same care you refused to give him." I stepped forward and gently took Sophia, using the calming techniques Emily still hadn't mastered. The baby settled immediately, which only made Emily's realization more painful. "She knows what to do," Emily said, staring at me with something like awe. "She's been doing this alone for years, while I built a new life," Ethan finished quietly. "While you abandoned your family," Emily corrected. That night, Emily called me crying. "Clara, I don't know what to do. I feel like I don't even know who I married. He told me you were bitter, that you turned Jimmy against him, that the divorce was about money. But now I see... God, I see everything." "What do you see, Emily?" I asked gently, pouring myself a glass of wine and settling in for what I knew would be a very satisfying conversation. "I see a woman who loved her child enough to become an expert in his care. I see a mother who built a support network and learned everything she could to help her son thrive. And I see a man who ran away when things got difficult. Bingo." "Emily," I said softly, "would you like to bring Sophia over tomorrow? Jimmy would love to meet his sister properly, and I could show you some techniques that might help with her sleep issues." "Could I? Really?" "Of course. Family takes care of family." As I hung up the phone, I smiled into the darkness of my living room. Phase 1 was complete. Emily now saw Ethan for who he really was, and she was turning to me for guidance. Soon, she'd realised that everything she needed for Sophia's care, I already possessed. But this was just the beginning, because tomorrow, when Emily brought Sophia to our house, she'd see something that would change everything. She'd see the life Ethan had abandoned, the home he'd walked away from, and the father Jimmy deserved but never had. And that's when my real revenge would begin. Emily arrived at my house the next morning with Sophia, and I watched through my window as she sat in her car for a full 5 minutes, staring at our home. Not the cramped apartment she probably expected, but the beautiful house I'd bought with my divorce settlement. The one Ethan never knew about because he'd been too busy with his new life to pay attention to mine. When she finally knocked, I opened the door with Jimmy by my side. My beautiful boy, now 8 years old, confident and thriving in ways his father had never bothered to see. "Hi, Jimmy," Emily said softly. "I'm Emily, and this is your sister, Sophia." Jimmy looked at our baby with genuine curiosity, then up at me. "She's really small, Mama. Does she need help like I did when I was little?" "Yes, sweetheart, she does." "Then we'll take good care of her," he said with that matter-of-fact kindness that made my heart swell with pride every single day. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she watched Jimmy gently touch Sophia's tiny hand. This was the child Ethan had been ashamed of. The son he'd called difficult and embarrassing. "Come in," I said, leading her into our living room. Warm, comfortable, filled with Jimmy's artwork and photos of his achievements. Nothing like the sterile perfection of her house. "Clara, this place is beautiful," Emily breathed, looking round. "It's so lived in, so happy." "We've made a good life here," I said simply, settling Sophia into the baby swing I'd retrieved from storage. "Haven't we, Jimmy?" Jimmy nodded enthusiastically. "Mama, can I show Emily my sensory room?" Emily looked confused. "Sensory room?" I smiled. "I converted the spare bedroom into a sensory space for Jimmy. Would you like to see it?" What Emily saw when I opened that door changed everything. Professional-grade equipment, carefully chosen lighting, weighted blankets, a ball pit, climbing structures, everything arranged to create the perfect environment for a child with sensory processing needs. "This must have cost a fortune," she whispered. "It did, but Jimmy is worth every penny." I let that sink in before adding, "I used most of my divorce settlement to create this space and set up his college fund." "College fund?" Jimmy is incredibly bright, Emily. His autism isn't a limitation. It's just a different way of processing the world. He'll go to college, have a career, maybe even a family of his own someday. I've made sure of it. Emily was quiet as we returned to the living room, where Jimmy was now sitting next to Sophia's swing, reading her a story in his gentle, careful voice. "He's wonderful," she said, and I could hear the amazement in her voice. "He's nothing like Ethan described." "What did Ethan tell you about Jimmy?" Emily's face flushed. He said Jimmy was difficult, that he had violent meltdowns, that he couldn't function in normal situations, that he would never be independent. I felt that familiar rage building, but I kept my voice steady. Jimmy hasn't had a meltdown in over a year. He's in regular classes at school with minimal support. He has friends, he plays soccer on a special needs team, and he's reading at a 6th grade level. But Ethan said what he needed to say to justify abandoning his son. I sat down across from Emily, my voice growing harder. "Tell me, Emily, when was the last time your husband spent quality time with Jimmy? When was the last time he attended a school event or therapy session?" Emily's silence was answer enough. "The truth is, Ethan never gave Jimmy a chance. He saw the diagnosis and decided our son was broken, defective, something to be ashamed of. So he ran. To you. To your perfect life. To your normal baby." Emily started crying then. Not the desperate sobs from before, but the deep, painful tears of someone whose entire world view was crumbling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I thought I was saving him from a difficult situation." "You thought you were getting a fresh start with a man who could handle real life," I said quietly. "But here's what you're learning now, Emily. When things get difficult, Ethan runs. He always has, and he always will." That's when I played my final card. "There's something else you should know," I said, pulling out my phone, "about the custody arrangement." Emily looked up confused. "Ethan was supposed to have Jimmy every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. Court-ordered visitation. Would you like to know how many times he's actually taken his son in the past year?" Emily's face went pale. "How many?" 3 times. 3 times in 12 months. And each time he brought Jimmy back early because of some excuse. Jimmy was too tired, too overstimulated, too difficult to manage. I showed her my meticulously kept calendar. Every missed visit documented, every excuse recorded. "But he pays child support," Emily said weakly. "Money isn't parenting, Emily. Jimmy doesn't need his father's money. The college fund I mentioned, it's worth more than Ethan makes in 2 years. What Jimmy needed was his father's love, his patience, his commitment. Things money can't buy." Emily stared at the calendar, and I could see her connecting dots she'd been too blind to see before. "The weekend trips," she whispered. "All those weekend getaways we took while I was pregnant. Those were the weekends he was supposed to have Jimmy." "Every single one!" Emily stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Oh God. What have I done? I helped him abandon his own child." "You didn't know," I said, but we both knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd chosen not to look too closely at the situation because it was easier to believe Ethan's version. "What kind of father will he be to Sophia?" she asked, her voice breaking. "If he could abandon Jimmy, what's to stop him from doing the same to her when things get difficult?" And there it was, the question I'd been waiting for her to ask. "Emily," I said gently, "what do you think happens when Sophia starts having meltdowns? When she needs therapy 3 times a week? When she can't handle birthday parties or loud restaurants? When your perfect life becomes complicated and messy and real?" Emily sank back into her chair, the weight of realization crushing her. "He'll leave us too. Maybe. Or maybe he'll do what he did with Jimmy. Stay physically present but emotionally absent. Either way, you and Sophia will be on your own." That's when Emily asked the question that made my entire plan worth it. "Clara, would you help us? Would you teach me what you know?" I looked at Jimmy, still reading softly to his baby sister, then back at Emily's desperate face. "Of course I will, but not for Ethan, for Sophia, and for Jimmy. who deserves to have a relationship with his sister. What happened next was even better than I'd planned. Emily filed for divorce 3 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences and Ethan's abandonment of his parental responsibilities. She moved out of their perfect house and into a smaller place 15 minutes from us. The custody hearing was brutal. Emily testified about Ethan's pattern of abandonment, his lies about Jimmy's condition, his complete lack of preparation for Sophia's needs. My documentation became evidence. My expert knowledge became testimony. Ethan lost custody of both children. But here's the beautiful twist that even I didn't see coming. Emily and I became friends. Real friends. She enrolled in parenting classes for children with special needs. She joined my support group. She learned to be the mother both Jimmy and Sophia deserved. And Jimmy? Jimmy blossomed having his sister in his life. He became her protector, her teacher, her biggest advocate. Watching him help Sophia with her sensory issues, seeing him read to her every night, witnessing the pure love between them, it healed something in my heart I didn't even know was broken. 6 months later, I was tucking both children into bed when Jimmy looked up at me with those wise eyes of his. "Mama, I'm glad Daddy left us." "Why, sweetheart?" "Because now we have Sophia and Emily, and we're a real family, not the pretend kind." That night, as I watched Emily gently rock Sophia to sleep using techniques I'd taught her, I realised something incredible. My revenge hadn't just destroyed Ethan's perfect life. It had created something better than I'd ever imagined. Ethan lost everything. His wife, his children, his reputation, his perfect facade. But Sophia gained a mother who would fight for her. Jimmy gained a father figure in Emily who actually showed up. And I gained something I'd never expected. A partner in raising these two amazing children. The best revenge, it turns out, wasn't destroying Ethan's happiness. It was building something so much better from the ashes of what he'd thrown away. Sometimes, karma doesn't just balance the scales, it tips them completely in favour of those who truly deserve happiness. And that's how the man who abandoned his family for a perfect life ended up losing everything, while the woman he discarded built the family he never deserved. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply becoming everything they could never be.